In 2009, Bernie Madoff pled guilty to 11 felony counts, confessing to the largest Ponzi scheme fraud in history. He's a con man straight out of Dickens who ripped off thousands of victims, including the rich and famous, banks, and charitable organizations. What the Insider Exclusive will examine in this legal mess is, did Madoff have any help? Where's the money? Does he have it? Did he act alone? Will investors get their money back? This special Insider Exclusive report will examine every single possible avenue to reveal the truth. Hi, I'm Steve Murphy, and this is the Insider Exclusive. Today we're going inside the legal maze of the Bernie Madoff scandal and the strategies to uncover the Madoff money trail. We're going to feature Andrew Entwistle, managing partner of Entwistle Cappucci, Norb Vonnegut, one of Wall Street's insiders, and Larry McShane, New York Daily News staff writer. Stay tuned. I want to welcome to the show Andrew Entwistle. Welcome.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here.
You're heavily involved with this Bernie Madoff situation. What really happened with Madoff?
Well, as the public knows now, Madoff was a Ponzi scheme, pure and simple. And the way he got all these investors to come in over the years was he started with the grandfathers of the investors we have today, and he was their banker. And he took a little bit of money from them. He gave them a great consistent return. And in the beginning, it seems like he actually made investments for them and made some legitimate investments when he was very small. But as he continued to take money in order to maintain this reputation in the community that he was building, he had to keep paying consistent returns. And in order to do that, he had no strategy that would allow him to make those types of payments. So he started what we commonly know as a Ponzi scheme, using current money in to pay off, prior money.
There's been a lot of attention directed to the SEC because there were individuals, money managers, as well as I think it was Harry Markopolos, who brought to their attention the fact that there's no way that he could consistently give these kinds of returns over the last 20 years, especially in an up and down market. Why wasn't the government paying attention to this?
Well, in the one sense, it's a very unregulated area. I mean, this is hedge fund money coming in,
Yes.
direct investment money coming in. It's not like we're talking about public offerings where you do a filing and the SEC is looking at it day to day. So that's part of it. Of course, it did look at Madoff on at least 2 occasions and gave him a clean bill, quote unquote, clean bill of health at those times. Those investigations have been roundly criticized publicly, I think,
Yes.
at this point. They've been the subject of congressional investigations, and I think it's now clear that the investigator involved in that case, who later married, one of the Madoff daughters, really didn't do the job he was supposed to do. Apparently was complicit, though that has yet to be proven. We'll see how that shakes out over the long term. But clearly, anybody who took a hard look at Bernie Madoff through all of these years, could clearly see all of the red flags that have now become fairly common knowledge. He was his own broker-dealer. He didn't have an independent broker-dealer, so there were no checks and balances.
Yeah.
He had a little 2-person accounting firm in Rockland County doing the accounting for a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. There was no investment strategy which could be recreated or replicated, even as he described it, to generate the types of returns that he did. They were so consistent over time, et cetera, et cetera. And really, you had 2 sets of folks coming in to Madoff.
Right.
You had direct investors, many of whom started small with him and increased their investments over time and really used Bernie Madoff as a money market. And why not? They were getting consistent 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 15% returns depending on where and when they put their money in. And that was so much better than they could get at any money market anywhere else. And even if they were relatively sophisticated people generally, They figured, hey, he's as good as a bank. And the money was always there when they asked for it. And they never questioned the statements that they got. And they got statements as regular as clockwork. And you can talk to any of the investors, and we've talked to many who've come to us for help and guidance here. When you get consistent statements, they all look good. You get an audit report at the end of the year, you know, they figured they were fine. And they didn't have anyone on the outside checking. Now, the more sophisticated folks who had independent financial advisors, the best of those, turned and went to Bernie Madoff and said, well, we'd like to meet with you. We'd like to do certain things. We'd like to review your strategies. In many cases, Madoff wouldn't meet with them. He wouldn't explain his strategies.
Right.
He couldn't back it up or replicate it. And those better money managers said, don't put your money with Madoff.
Yeah.
Or if you have it there, take it out.
Yeah, the interesting thing is what did him in is not his whole Ponzi scheme, but the economy as a whole. Because when people lost their money, they went to Bernie, where they thought their money was, to get money. And he had too many redemptions.
I think part of it are the redemptions.
Yeah.
In particular, redemptions coming in through feeder funds, which is the other place that people put money in. On the individual side, I think really what was happening was people were taking out money from their other investments. All these folks were coming out through 2007, 2008, who later in 2008, who came out of the stock market and wanted to put their money somewhere that they perceived to be safe. So they took their money and they put it with Bernie, who was earning consistent 9, 10, 11, 12% returns and more.
Yeah.
And those investors got very, very hurt. But that money coming in earlier then started to come out as people started to need it. And he just couldn't keep up with the redemptions at that point, because he now had grown so large that no amount of redemptions could ever be supported by money, new money coming in.
Sure.
And that was really, I think, what hurt him in the end.
Your law firm primarily represents major investment firms and large investors when they seek to recover on some of these fraudulent schemes. Who are some of the other responsible parties besides Bernie Madoff? There are other organizations, entities. What are they?
Well, there are a lot of them, obviously, in this mix. And we represent a lot of big public pension funds, a lot of financial institutions, a lot of very high net worth individuals and investors, both in their corporate and transactional dealings, bankruptcy, and of course litigation as well. In this context, we're representing them in some cases to recover monies that were lost, and in other cases to deal with the clawback issue and give them other related advice. But specifically with respect to recovering against other parties, the best probably example of that is the Tremont litigation. And in the Tremont case, we have been appointed by Judge Grisey as one of the lead counsel representing folks who brought state law related claims for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, those types of claims.
Yes.
And those claims are brought against the money managers. They're brought against the funds themselves.
Individually?
Well, individually. So what we have are, for example, claims against the Rye Group money managers, right? The Rye Group of funds, which were part of the Tremont Group. And people have heard a lot about Tremont.
And they lost like $3.7 billion?
Overall, upwards of $3 billion. And that money that Rye invested then was part of Tremont. And of course, Tremont is part of Oppenheimer, which is part of Mass Mutual. And so there's this kind of chain that comes down, and we've got claims against each of the money managers directly for failure to exercise proper fiduciary duties. And then you've got claims following that against Tremont itself as a manager and as exercising oversight. And the same for Oppenheimer and Mass Mutual, who were very, very directly involved in every facet of the management and operation of Tremont: advertising, promotion, regulatory oversight, internal due diligence and oversight. And in the case of Bernie Madoff, they all sat back fat and happy and enjoyed enormous profits and returns without exercising any due diligence at all.
Even though Tremont lost upwards of $3 billion, there's deep pockets you're going after, aren't there?
Well, of course, you have Mass Mutual and Oppenheimer who profited as Tremont profited.
Yes.
And remember, we talk about Tremont losing. It's not Tremont really that's losing. It's Tremont's limited partners. It's Tremont's investors that are losing that money.
Right. You brought up the issue of clawbacks. We hear a lot about that. What does that exactly mean, and who is susceptible to, who's vulnerable to that?
Well, the SEPA trustee, SEPA is the act that acts in a sense as insurance for direct investors. Now, in this case, it's not providing insurance to folks who invested through feeder funds. They don't get SEPA benefits. But those who are direct investors get up to $500,000,
Yes.
Depending on their circumstances, for each customer. And so it depends on how many accounts you have.
And that's
how they
$100,000 in cash, max, isn't it? And $400,000 in securities?
Well, that's if you've got cash in the account as opposed to securities.
Yeah.
Now, these accounts all supposedly had in securities.
Yeah, they
them.
don't have any securities.
Okay, but there were no real securities.
Yeah.
So there's some question as to
How much
is it
money
cash, is it securities, and how that's going to be dealt with.
Yeah.
It seems like the SEPA trustee is going to be treating that as all as securities.
Even though they didn't own any.
You know, well, the investors thought that they did and were told that they did.
And they have statements.
And they have statements that say that they did. There are real questions as to whether, you know, Madoff actually bought any securities. Right. That's still coming out in the wash as we go.
So there's
the
still
process.
some flexibility how the government interprets some of these things for the benefit of the investors, correct?
There's some flexibility, certainly in how the SEPA trustee looks at the account holders and the customers and defines customer and how broadly. On the clawback side, it's going to depend on how aggressive the trustee is. The trustee's issued some guidelines.
Yes. And
so
clawback, what is the time frame that they can go back?
Well, there's kind of two aspects to clawback.
Yeah.
One are what we call bankruptcy preferences.
Yeah.
Under the bankruptcy code, 90 days, for 90 days, no matter why the money was transferred out of the bankrupt entity,
right,
the trustee can come in and seek the return of those funds. Mm-hmm. And then the entity has to come in as a claimant or a creditor and seek, you know, return of all or a part of that in the normal course in a bankruptcy. Mm-hmm. And so that is clearly happening here. The SEPA trustee has already started some very, very large preference actions. It started one against Chase. It started one against a couple of other entities in the last few weeks. And we're told there are going to be a number more. And these are seeking hundreds of millions of dollars in the return of funds to the bankrupt estate.
Right.
Those are the easiest, quote unquote, easiest claims for the trustee to make. The second category of clawback claims are the fraudulent conveyance claims. And under the bankruptcy code and under state law, the trustee can attempt to seek money back, any money that's been paid by the Ponzi scheme operator, for lack of a better term here, for its own benefit. In other words, to keep the scheme going. So here, that would include all the payments, obviously.
There's no time frame in that.
There is a time frame, and it depends on, right now, we don't know which time frame is going to apply. The bankruptcy code says 2 years. Under New York state law, it will either be 3 years or possibly as long as 6 years.
Yes.
In terms of a look back.
There are some investors who got preferential treatment. There has been one in the news, I believe his name is Stanley Chase, who on an average over a period of 20 years, his annual return was, I think, 40% a year, much higher than everybody else. Some years, 300% return. Are they subject to a clawback, considering the fact that they were experiencing these amazing returns and the fact that he might have known something was awry?
Well, there's no question about that. Mm-hmm. Merkin is another one who's recently, been attacked by the SEPA trustee, and I think appropriately so.
Yes.
And
that's Erza Merkin.
Right.
Okay.
In being fully knowledgeable about what Bernie Madoff was doing, and going into that process simply to get these enormously juiced returns, as people are calling them.
Juiced returns.
Really juiced returns.
That's pretty complicated, and that's why we have you on the show, because there's a lot more we can talk about. But first, I want to bring on one of New York news writers, the Daily News, Larry McShane. And he's written a lot about the Bernie Madoff thing. We'll bring him on right now. Larry, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
You've written a lot about Bernie Madoff, his family, his sons. What's your opinion of this whole mess here?
the family, I think, is an interesting part of it. I think one of the reasons they were able to do this for so long is it was a family-run business. It's very insular. They were involved with the person who did their accounting. One person ran a small company in the suburbs up in Westchester, a storefront, not one of the large accounting firms that you might associate with a huge operation like this, a $65 billion operation. So his family is a big part of it. He's got 2 sons who were with him when he turned himself in and admitted to the whole thing. And his wife is still living in their penthouse on 68th Street while he is down in the Metropolitan Correctional Center awaiting his sentencing in June.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, as a lawyer, do you think that they knew anything about what he was doing?
Well, there's no question that they knew. And, you know, there's no way that you could generate the tens of thousands of statements that went out every month, like clockwork, that were all different and had all these different securities, and to handle the flow of cash in and out, and payments to investors and deposits from investors without a large staff that was supervised by people who were clearly in the know about what was happening. You know, no one person or 2 people could have run an operation of this magnitude. Yeah. And, you know, keep in mind that his sons were involved with the trading operation. Now, they knew full well that his father had 20 billion or 30 billion or 40, whatever the number is, under management. And yet they also knew that no trades were being placed through their operation.
The sons knew that.
They had to. They ran the trading operation.
That's Mark and Andrew, is that right?
Exactly right. So, you know, how did the sons sit there a floor away, right, and know Dad's got all this money under management, and they didn't wonder where all these trades were being placed from? There were no traders on this infamous 17th floor. Yeah. So they knew full well what was happening here, and of course all this money was coming in some very creative ways, you know, into the entity. So clearly the family knew.
What leads are you following up on now, Larry, with the wife, the sons, you know, as a reporter?
Before his bail hearing, the court received 171 pages of emails and letters from victims of the fund. And as you can imagine, everyone had a story to tell of, you know, dreams lost, homes lost, retirements lost. So that's one thing. Another thing is the feeder funds, as you mentioned. Andrew Cuomo, the Attorney General in New York, is starting to look into this. I know the officials in Massachusetts and Connecticut have already started to look into it too. So I think it may at some point extend beyond just Picard trying to follow up on this and get the money back. There's $65 billion. They've recovered $1 billion. There's a lot of money out there. And for somebody who's politically ambitious, Cuomo has been mentioned as a possible gubernatorial candidate. This would make a good target and something to go after. So I think you may see it spread beyond just the trustee, and you may see other people going after the money as well.
You wrote a story on Madoff. I think that's what you called it, right?
Yeah.
How are you following up on, I believe, wasn't it correct, Andrew, that she transferred $15 million or something like that 2 days before he confessed to this, you know, this crime of the century?
Well, I think that'll be part of the thing as well. We talked about the sons. I think there's been a lot of speculation anyway that the whole way that he turned himself in, the way the plea was handled, was all designed to shield the wife and the sons from any sort of economic liability. I guess the question would be now, what does the trustee do? Does he go after that money? They've already gone down and seized, I guess, a yacht in Florida. There's talk about going after the property in France and in Florida. So I guess the question is, at what point does the trustee maybe decide to go beyond the boundaries of what we know already?
Well, I want to thank you very much for being on the program. I know you have to get back to the news desk, right?
Yeah, thank you.
Now, I'm very pleased to have with us Norb Vonnegut, who is a Wall Street insider and an author of a new book, which is called Top Producer. And here's the book. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Steve. It's nice to be here.
When I say Wall Street insider, you worked on Wall Street, what, 15 years? With some of the big trading houses, didn't you?
Right, absolutely. Morgan Stanley.
And you write a blog now, too, don't you, called Acrimony?
Acrimony.
Acrimony.
Right, and the premise of the blog is that where there's money, there's conflict.
That's interesting. I think there's an old saying. What is that old saying about the root of all evil is money or something like that?
Certainly one of the roots. Anyway.
Yeah. You've been watching this whole Bernie Madoff thing unfold, and you've come up with kind of your own red flags for people to be aware of so they don't fall victim to some of these Ponzi schemes. What are some of them?
Well, in acrimony, I've listed 10, but I think the single most important is the issue of transparency. If your money manager says it's complicated when he explains his investment style, or your money manager says it's proprietary, that's a red flag. Grab your wallet and walk in the opposite direction.
I've seen over the years that a lot of money is spent on lobbyists, lobbying for hedge funds, for example, not to come under the same supervision that other mutual funds and other securities are in the United States. And I think one of the most successful funds over the years has been a fund that has been managed by George Soros. And generally they had non-U.S. citizens in the fund, so they wouldn't have to abide by some of the laws. Are some of these hedge funds, I mean, really, do some of these hedge funds do have proprietary trading systems that if they had to reveal how they were trading, it would cause them not to have the same results as they're normally having?
There are a lot of very talented people in the hedge fund industry, first and foremost, who do have proprietary systems that are absolutely legal and they're good value added for the investors. But the fact is, if you cannot explain what your money manager is doing, if you can't articulate to your kids how he or she is investing your money, you have no business investing with them, no matter how good or how proprietary they are.
I think that's a fair statement, Steve. I think the other part of that is that, you know, the old black box type model, these, you know, hugely complex algorithms, et cetera, have by and large been revealed to not generate a lot of additional value and not be in a position where they can't be easily explained to a layperson. You may not understand the math involved in creating the algorithm, but you ought to understand what the strategy is behind it. And I think that's the kind of transparency that Norb is talking about. And secondarily, you or your personal manager ought to be able to recreate that strategy to some extent. Maybe not in as nuanced a fashion as someone trading, you know, in high volumes, you know, based on an algorithm with computers, et cetera. But you ought to basically be able to recreate the returns. That's something that no one could do with Bernie Madoff. And it was one of the biggest red flags there. And I think that feeds into this transparency issue that Norb was talking about.
There was another issue that I think you brought up about the fact that where your money is placed. If you have a money manager and you're getting trading statements, in the Bernie Madoff case, you got the trading statements from the same place that the money manager was managing the money. What are one of the red flags there?
Well, that is absolutely a huge issue. One of the things that I'd like to see happen is to separate money managers from the reporting function. And by that I mean, for years, I worked with clients to set up accounts where we had a money manager who bought the calls, bought the bonds, wired money, did whatever was necessary to manage money. They provided financial statements. At the same time, we set up accounts with custodians, where the custodians, they held those securities. They received cash in. They received the coupon payments, the dividends. They also sent out monthly statements, and the monthly statements were in addition to those sent by the money managers. The value to the everyday investor is that you have two sets of financial statements. If you separate money management from financial reporting, guys like Bernie Madoff lose control of the flow of information and they unravel. They can't sustain the game. Game over.
You know, that's great advice, and I certainly hope a lot of people follow that in the future to avoid these problems. And I want to thank you very much for being on this program.
Thanks, Steve.
Andrew, we've listened to a Wall Street Insider. We've also had somebody who's daily on top of the things with the daily news. In summary, how would you say that investors should be able to feel comfortable in regaining and recapturing some of the money they lost through Madoff?
Well, you know, I think there's two things investors need to, you know, sort of take away from this at this point, or three. First, of course, is to protect what you already have.
Yeah.
So, you know, if you're someone who has taken out a significant amount of money over time here, then you need to be worried about clawback, even if you haven't gotten a letter in the first round. You should be talking to your legal advisors, talking to somebody who's experienced with clawback issues, and making sure that the strategy you're pursuing now is an appropriate strategy, and that someone is monitoring what's happening currently to make sure that your position is being appropriately protected. That's the first piece. And the second piece of that, of course, is you ought to be talking to a legal advisor to find out if in your specific individual circumstance, you're doing everything you can to recover those funds. Are you, for example, protected by one of the class claims that are being pursued, or consolidated cases that are now being massed? The Tremont case, for example, is before Judge Grisey. There are others. There are cases before the multi-district panel, which are all being funneled to one location. In some cases, that hasn't been determined yet.
Right.
So you ought to find out where you stand. If you're a big enough individual investor, you may want to pursue some of these remedies on your own, and your individual case may determine a different course of action. So you need to look at those types of issues.
Right.
You know, and lastly, I think, and of course, taxes we've talked about. Get with your tax advisor. The last piece of this, I think, is, and the biggest takeaway of all, is don't just blindly or blithely follow your money manager's advice, whoever they are. You as an investor need to be cynical. You need to ask the hard questions. And by all means, you know, have your accountant act, you know, as a secondary person. Have them copy it on all of the statements that you get.
I think really a big lesson to be learned here is it should be no secret as to how your money's supposedly making money, correct?
Well, I think that is the case. You know, you should have transparency. You know, and the old adage applies here as well as it does anywhere else. If it seems too good to be true, it usually is.
Yeah. I want to thank you very much for being on the program.
It's been my pleasure.
Can you hand out your website and a phone number where folks can get a hold of you, ask more questions about this whole thing?
Well, you can find out a lot of information about Madoff and related issues at our website, of course, which is www.entwistle-law-law.com.
Okay.
And our main number in New York is 212-894-7200.
Thank you for being with us.
It's my pleasure.
Thanks for watching. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at www.insiderexclusive.tv.